Welcome back. It's my great pleasure to welcome Andrew Fox with us today. He's in his second year of being an early career researcher at the research associate at the Institute of Classical Studies, and starts a new job at the University of Reading on Monday. Congratulations for that. He also just had a book come out in August, Trees in Ancient Rome, Growing an Empire, with Bloomsbury's Ancient Environment series, another one that I need to add to my already very full reading list, but that sounds fantastic. Previously, he's also published on trees, on Trajan's Column, and mitigating environmental pollution in ancient spaces. And he's an article in the Q for the Classical Quarterly, exploring the definition of grove and the management in the Roman world. You're very welcome, Andrew.
Well, thank you for that lovely introduction and for the invitation as well. When Jason sent me the invite at the start of the summer and said it can be work in progress, doesn't really matter about it being a fully polished thing, I took that to heart, really. And I picked up an idea that I'd had about 2 months into my PhD in 2014, and sort of kept going back to dipping in on, never really dealing with, and it's always sort of lingered, and this gave me an excuse to actually put my thoughts down on paper. So whether or not there's going to be a conclusion, we'll find out. But right now it's a bit of a collection of thoughts, and sometimes I've had a conclusion at the end when I've run through it. So, Seneca's Thyestes is a Neronian tragedy which may or may not have been performed. I have always personally decided on it will have been performed, just because I can't bear the idea of it not being. It's such a fun play. It covers essentially the relationship between Atreus and Thyestes, the slaughter of Thyestes' children, and his forced cannibalism of them. It's quite light, really. And this paper is going to focus specifically on 8 lines of the play. At the climax, really, the messenger speech occurs, and the messenger describes the quasi-sacrifice of Thyestes' children to the audience, and this occurs in a grove, and this is quite close. This extract is quite close to the start of the speech. The messenger indicates that the scene is set deep in the recesses of Atreus' palace, in a hidden spot, a secret spot, in a deep valley. This is right at the heart of the kingdom. And then he describes a grove and names 4 trees, or 4 types of tree. The taxus, the cupressus, and the quercus. And for the remainder of this paper, we'll focus on each of these types of tree individually. But before we get to that, I want to just highlight 2 key points about this passage. The first is that the grove is a namus, not a lucus. That is typically used to describe a grove of artificial construction or with buildings within it, so temples, etc. It is also not a grove that has been managed. It has never seen or felt the axe, is how I translated it a couple of weeks ago, but now I feel more like that should be more generic. It's never been pruned, it's never been maintained, it's just been allowed to grow within the confines of the palace. The artificial features of this grove are the monuments of the Tantalid dynasty. Pelops' chariot, for example, is there, and these are all described immediately after this passage. The 4 trees identified are a yew, a cypress, several holm oak trees, and one tall and eminent oak. And each one of these 4 species carries with it various connotations. First, we have the yew. This is the typical Italian yew, likely what Seneca was thinking of, as opposed to the English yew. This is the Taxus baccata, and this is a particularly old example. I think it's fair to assume that all the trees in this grove were in fact quite old, simply because of the age of the palace, because of the size of the oak tree that grows at the centre, and because of the descriptions of the shade within the passage. So what we can assume from what we can take from this is you've got quite widespread needles, it's resinous, the trunk is very broad, you're going to get quite dark shade underneath, which means that these descriptions from ancient literature of the yew are particularly relevant. Virgil describes the yew as being harmful or noxious. Pliny, in quite a long invective about the yew and poison, talks about there being a yew in Arcadia that is so poisonous that any who sleep under it or take food from it will die. In Bostock's translation, in the Lerb edition, there is a little footnote which is absolutely delightful here, which says, "This is a statement so ridiculous it deserves no contradiction." But the idea of poisonous shade is not unique to the yew in Pliny. He describes the shade of various resinous trees, including the fir tree or abies, as being undoubtedly poisonous. And Columella talks about how underneath a fir tree or a yew tree, the ground is made sterile. It's a very basic understanding of photosynthesis and the need of light for plants to thrive. The yew also features in Lucan's Civil War. Once again, Lucan highlights that the yew is impervious to the sun and creates quite dark shade. So immediately, in this one line of Seneca's Thyestes, which names 3 types of tree, we are immediately introduced to the idea of this grove being dark and oppressive. It's not filled with dappled light. We aren't looking at Tityrus lounging underneath a beech tree at the start of the eclogues. We're looking at a grove that's going to make you quite nervous because there is no light there. And the association with poison is also very important, and I'll get back to that right at the end. The next tree mentioned is the cypress tree. This is probably the Cupressus sempervirens, and those of us who have been to Italy or seen fancy estates in the UK will be very familiar with the cypress tree as found on the at the top there. Very neatly pruned, thin, conical. You're not going to assume that it's going to cast a lot of shade, and they're used as boundary markers in gardens in the ancient world and today. But this is a grove that's never been pruned, it's never been touched by the axe. And what we have at the bottom is an example of a cypress tree that has never been pruned. They grow quite bushy, quite thick. Again, we have dark shade cast underneath it, no plants growing underneath it because they can't get the sun. And it just begins to build this picture of a dark grove. But that's not the important thing about the cypress tree. The cypress tree is associated with one thing and one thing only: death. It is a witness to grief in Lucan's description of the grove outside of Marseille. It follows masters to death where nothing else, no legacy, no land, no house, no wife, no other trees that you planted will, the cypress will follow you to death. And Pliny gives an explanation of this in the Natural History. The cypress is sacred to Dis and hung at doors as a sign of mourning. I'm using all the way through texts that are either contemporary, roughly contemporary, or prior to Seneca, because I think it's important to make the point that those people reading or watching Seneca's plays will have been aware of these trees, and this forms part of a literary tradition of groves. So we've got the yew that is dark, shady, poisonous, and the cypress that is also dark, shady, and heavily associated with death, not just in poetry but in everyday life, being hung on doors as a sign of mourning. The third tree is the home oak, or the Quercus ilex. Ilex is often translated as oak, and you'd be forgiven for thinking it was an oak like the English oak, with quite lovely dappled shade, broad spreading branches, delicate leaves with soft pendulate lobing. It's not. The Quercus ilex is reasonably pleasant to sit under, but it has thick leaves with sharp points, as seen at the top there. It is sometimes, ilex is sometimes used to describe the holly, which is also called acrifolium or aquifolium, sharp leaf. In Latin, depending upon the era, it becomes aquifolium later. And once again, the ilex is noted for being dark. In Ovid's Herodes, describing where Jason and Medea meet, who are a couple known for their happy endings, Ovid uses the home oak and the pitch pine as the only trees within this grove, setting a scene of misfortune to come. Lucan, again describing the grove outside of Marseille, that Caesar fells personally before sending his soldiers in to fell it, names the ilex within it. But there is a bigger association for the ilex, which is the last tree of this line. It is a common feature in funeral pyres, beginning with, in Latin literature, beginning with Ennius's Annals, then Virgil in Dido's pyre, in Hercules' pyre. It's also Hercules' gravestone, and then later in Silas Italicus's Punica. So what we've got in this line is a journey from poison to death to burning, just in the trees. Very much similar to what's going to happen. Killing, death, cooking, within this scene. And it's all overshadowed by one tree. The oak, the Quercus robur. This is the English oak. That's our best guess as to what Quercus typically refers to. By description, all of these identifications are based on descriptions offered in like Pliny and so on, and an assumption that they're a fairly well-grounded assumption, in fairness, that identifications remain consistent across some, if not most, of Latin literature. This tree is tall, it is old, it has broad laterally spreading branches, and it allows things to grow up underneath it. It is, unlike all the other trees, deciduous, meaning it sheds its leaves in the winter. And unlike the yew and the cypress, it is also a leafy tree, as opposed to needles. Oak isn't really associated with death, but there is one aspect to the Quercus robur that I would like to draw attention to here. It features in one of the, in my opinion, best tree similes in all of Latin literature, where Pompey is compared to a lofty oak in a fruitful field, allowing its little saplings to grow up and other trees to grow up in its shade, when in reality it's going to fall down any day now, as Pompey obviously does. And this, I think, is where where Seneca is driving with the oak, standing at the heart of the tantalid grove, allowing these trees of death to grow up underneath it, where you have a man at the start of a dynasty, Tantalus, creating a legacy that will affect all of his descendants, creating that environment and overshadowing it all. The oak, I feel, in this description is a metaphor for Tantalus, and the trees, the death trees that have grown underneath, are associated with the curse of the Tantalid house and its ongoing effects. That's where I've got to.